The ornate Senate committee room fell silent as Senator Ted Cruz leaned forward from his elevated position on the dais, his piercing gaze fixed on Representative Jasmine Crockett, who sat calmly at the witness table, completely unaware that the young congresswoman from Texas had spent the past 4 months methodically documenting his contradictory positions on immigration, energy policy, and federal oversight through thousands of pages of public statements, voting records, and private correspondence that would systematically dismantle every criticism he was about to make. Cruz, with his Harvard law credentials and 12 years of Senate experience, adjusted his microphone and prepared to deliver what he clearly intended to be a career-defining embarrassment of the freshman representative who had dared to challenge his immigration reform proposals during recent committee hearings. Representative Crockett, Cruz began, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone who had built his reputation on courtroom advocacy and political debate. Your recent statements about border security demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of both constitutional law and practical policy implementation that raises serious questions about your readiness to participate in serious discussions about America's immigration challenges. The packed gallery buzzed with anticipation as political reporters, immigration advocates, and congressional staff prepared to witness what appeared to be a routine political takedown, having no idea they were about to see one of the most comprehensive document-based confrontations in modern congressional history. Senator Ted Cruz commanded respect across conservative circles as one of the most formidable debaters in the Senate. His Supreme Court clerkship and Solicitor General experience having honed his ability to dismantle opponents through precise legal reasoning and rhetorical skill. His Harvard Law Review background and successful Supreme Court advocacy had made him a feared interrogator in committee hearings, where his methodical questioning style had exposed numerous witnesses' inconsistencies and forced embarrassing admissions from even seasoned political figures. When Cruz spoke about constitutional interpretation or policy analysis, Republican colleagues listened, conservative media quoted him extensively, and even Democratic opponents acknowledged his intellectual rigor and preparation. Representative Jasmine Crockett, despite being just 2 years into her congressional career, had built a reputation for thorough preparation and substantive policy analysis that impressed veterans from both parties. What most observers didn't realize was that her background included extensive experience in opposition research and policy analysis from her work as a civil rights attorney, where she had regularly challenged powerful opponents by meticulously documenting their contradictory statements and policy positions. Her assignment to the House Immigration Subcommittee had been viewed by some as premature for a freshman representative, but Crockett had quickly demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of immigration law and federal policy that earned respect even from Republican colleagues who disagreed with her positions. The confrontation had been building since Crockett's appearance before the Senate Immigration Committee 3 weeks earlier, where she had criticized Cruz's immigration reform proposals as inconsistent with both constitutional principles and his own previous positions on federal immigration authority. Her testimony had generated significant media attention, with several policy experts praising her constitutional analysis, while conservative commentators suggested that a freshman House member shouldn't challenge experienced senators on complex immigration issues. Cruz, who typically avoided direct responses to House members' criticism, had made the unusual decision to use this oversight hearing to address Crockett's comments directly, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of what he viewed as uninformed policy analysis from junior members of Congress. Before we reveal how Jasmine Crockett's documents completely destroyed Ted Cruz's arguments, make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell, Because what happens next will shock you about political hypocrisy, and we've got more incredible congressional confrontations coming your way. Representative Crockett, Cruz continued, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made him famous during Supreme Court arguments. Your testimony 3 weeks ago revealed a troubling pattern of policy positions that seem designed more for media attention than serious governance. Your suggestion that my immigration proposals violate constitutional principles demonstrates exactly the kind of superficial analysis that prevents Congress from addressing America's border crisis effectively. He shuffled his papers with theatrical precision, building toward what he clearly intended to be a devastating critique. Your background in civil rights law, while admirable, hardly qualifies you to challenge immigration policies developed through years of constitutional analysis and practical experience. Perhaps instead of making inflammatory statements about colleagues' proposals, you might benefit from studying the actual legal and policy frameworks that govern immigration reform. Crockett remained composed as she organized the thick portfolio of documents she had brought to the hearing, her expression calm despite the magnitude of the political attack she was facing. Senator Cruz, I appreciate your perspective on immigration policy, and I certainly respect your extensive legal background. However, before we continue, I'd like to address some apparent inconsistencies between your current positions and statements you've made in other contexts about these same immigration principles. Cruz's confident expression shifted slightly, a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he wasn't expecting Crockett to challenge his immigration analysis directly. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Representative Crockett, but I can assure you that my positions on immigration reform have remained consistent throughout my Senate career, grounded in constitutional principles and practical necessity. I appreciate that assurance, Senator Cruz, Crockett replied, opening her portfolio methodically. That's what makes some of your previous statements particularly interesting to examine. For instance, in your 2018 speech to the Federalist Society about immigration federalism, you stated, and I'm quoting directly from the transcript, "Federal immigration enforcement must respect state sovereignty and local community concerns. Constitutional principles demand that immigration policy account for local conditions and state-level input rather than imposing uniform federal mandates." She displayed the Federalist Society speech transcript on a screen visible to the committee and gallery. Yet, in your immigration reform proposal introduced just last month, you wrote that uniform federal immigration standards must be applied consistently across all states without regard to local preferences or state-level variations. These positions seem directly contradictory. Has your understanding of immigration federalism changed significantly since 2018? A murmur rippled through the committee room as observers recognized the precision of Crockett's citation and the apparent contradiction she had identified. Cruz shifted in his chair, his prosecutorial confidence showing the first signs of uncertainty. Representative Crockett, immigration policy involves complex balancing of federal authority and state concerns. The principles remain consistent even when their application varies with changing circumstances. I understand that circumstances can affect policy implementation, Crockett acknowledged respectfully. That's why I've brought several other examples to help clarify the consistency of these principles. In your 2019 floor speech during the comprehensive immigration reform debate, you stated, "The Constitution requires Congress to consider humanitarian concerns and family unity as primary factors in immigration policy." We cannot ignore the human cost of immigration enforcement that separates families and destroys communities. She turned to a new section in her materials. Yet in your recent Fox News interview about current immigration challenges, you said, humanitarian concerns must take a back seat to enforcement priorities. Family unity considerations have prevented effective immigration control for too long. Again, these positions appear to be directly contradictory. Which statement reflects your actual view of humanitarian factors in immigration policy? Cruz's discomfort became more visible as he struggled to reconcile these contradictory statements without appearing to flip-flop on fundamental immigration principles. Representative Crockett, these quotes may sound contradictory when taken out of context, but they address different aspects of the complex relationship between enforcement priorities and humanitarian considerations. I've provided complete context for each quote in the materials I submitted to the committee. Crockett responded calmly, but let's examine another area where your positions appear inconsistent. In your testimony today, you criticized my superficial analysis and suggested that my civil rights background doesn't qualify me to comment meaningfully on immigration policy. Yet in this letter, you wrote to the Dallas Bar Association just 18 months ago. You praised my sophisticated constitutional analysis and nuanced understanding of immigration law. The tension in the committee room intensified as Cruz realized he was facing a methodical examination of his own inconsistencies rather than the defensive policy discussion he had anticipated. Representative Crockett, that letter addressed different aspects of your work in a different professional context. Actually, Senator Cruz, the letter specifically addressed my constitutional analysis of immigration federalism, the exact same issue we're discussing today, Crockett replied, referencing the document. But let's move to another area. In your criticism of my recent testimony, you suggested that challenging experienced senators' immigration proposals demonstrates superficial analysis. Yet in your 2020 book, One Vote Away, you wrote, "Vigorous challenge of established immigration policies, even from junior members of Congress, strengthens our democratic system by ensuring robust debate about constitutional principles." She displayed a page from Cruz's own book. You specifically encouraged junior members to challenge immigration orthodoxy and said that such challenges demonstrate healthy skepticism that prevents policy stagnation. This seems to contradict your suggestion that my challenges to your proposals represent superficial analysis. Which position reflects your actual view of junior members challenging immigration policy? Cruz's composure continued to deteriorate as the systematic presentation of contradictions made his earlier confident pronouncements appear increasingly untenable. Representative Crockett, there's a difference between constructive policy debate and fundamental misunderstanding of immigration law. I appreciate that distinction, Crockett responded. That's why I'd like to address your specific characterization of my policy understanding. In your opening statement today, you suggested that my civil rights background makes me unqualified to comment meaningfully on immigration reform. Yet in this interview you gave to the Texas Tribune last year, you stated, "We need more voices like Representative Crockett who combine practical legal experience with constitutional scholarship. Her background in civil rights law provides exactly the perspective needed for effective immigration reform." The display of the Texas Tribune interview transcript created a visible stir in the committee room. These assessments of my qualifications seem fundamentally incompatible. In the span of 12 months, have I somehow transformed from someone whose background provides exactly the perspective needed to someone with a fundamental misunderstanding of immigration law? Cruz attempted to maintain his senatorial composure, but his responses became increasingly defensive. Representative Crockett, policy assessments can evolve based on new information and changing political circumstances. That's certainly true, Crockett acknowledged. Evolution in thinking is natural and often valuable. But what concerns me is that today's characterizations present these positions as long-standing principles rather than recent evolutions. More importantly, these contradictions raise questions about consistency in immigration policy that go beyond our personal disagreement. She organized her documents carefully. For instance, in your current immigration reform proposal, you write that border security must take absolute priority over all other immigration considerations. Yet, in your 2017 Senate floor speech, you stated, "Effective immigration reform requires balanced consideration of security, economic needs, and humanitarian obligations. Border security alone cannot solve America's immigration challenges without comprehensive policy that addresses root causes." The display of Cruz's own Senate speech created another wave of reaction. These positions aren't just personally contradictory, they represent fundamentally different approaches to immigration policy. Which philosophy actually informed your current reform proposal? Cruz's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort as he struggled to address the systematic presentation of his contradictory positions. Representative Crockett, immigration policy involves complex analysis that may not always appear consistent to those without extensive legislative experience. "I respect the complexity of immigration policy," Crockett replied. "That's why I focused on your own statements rather than offering my own interpretations. What we're examining here isn't complexity, it's contradiction. When the same immigration principles are interpreted in directly opposite ways depending on the political context, it raises fundamental questions about consistency in policy development." She turned to her most damaging set of materials. "Perhaps most significantly, in your current immigration proposal, you write that comprehensive immigration reform represents a dangerous expansion of federal power that threatens constitutional governance. Yet in your 2019 campaign literature you stated, comprehensive immigration reform represents the constitutional solution to America's immigration crisis and demonstrates federal leadership on critical national challenges." The final display created the most significant reaction yet, with several observers audibly gasping at the stark contradiction between Cruz's current position and his previous campaign promises. These positions are irreconcilable. Either comprehensive immigration reform represents dangerous federal overreach or constitutional federal leadership. Both cannot be true simultaneously. Cruz sat in silence for several moments, the systematic presentation of his contradictions having effectively dismantled his earlier confident assertions about policy consistency. Finally, he spoke, his voice noticeably less authoritative than at the beginning of the hearing. "Representative Crockett, I acknowledge that some of my positions may appear inconsistent when presented in this manner. Immigration policy is an evolving challenge, and my thinking continues to develop as I encounter new information and political realities." "Thank you for that acknowledgement, Senator Cruz," Crockett responded respectfully. evolution in policy thinking is indeed natural and often valuable. My concern isn't that your positions have changed. It's that today's hearing presented those positions as unchanging constitutional principles while suggesting that disagreement with them represents fundamental legal misunderstanding. She gathered her materials with quiet dignity. I believe we can have more productive discussions about immigration policy when we acknowledge that even the most experienced legislators can hold evolving and sometimes contradictory positions. What matters most is that we evaluate immigration proposals based on their constitutional foundations and practical effectiveness rather than on the authority or experience of those who make them. The silence in the committee room was profound as Cruz struggled to formulate a response that could address the systematic presentation of contradictions without further undermining his position. Immigration policy experts in the gallery exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing they had witnessed something unprecedented in congressional oversight hearings. Senator Cruz, Crockett continued, I want to be clear that my purpose today isn't to embarrass you personally or undermine the Senate's institutional authority. Rather, it's to demonstrate that immigration policy benefits from honest acknowledgement of evolving perspectives rather than claims of unchanging principle. When we present shifting positions as eternal constitutional truths, we undermine the very intellectual honesty that strengthens democratic governance. She referenced another document from her portfolio. In fact, your own writings have eloquently made this point. In your 2016 Harvard Law Review article titled Political Evolution and Legislative Candor, you wrote, Intellectual honesty requires legislators to acknowledge when their understanding of policy issues has evolved rather than presenting new positions as historically inevitable. The strength of democratic governance lies not in rigid consistency, but in principled adaptation to new challenges and information. The display of Cruz's own academic writing, advocating for exactly the kind of intellectual honesty that Crockett was demonstrating, created a moment of uncomfortable recognition throughout the committee room. Several Republican senators who had gathered to support Cruz's questioning shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the irony of the situation. Senator Lindsey Graham, serving as committee chairman, attempted to redirect the hearing's focus. Perhaps we should move beyond these apparent inconsistencies and focus on the substantive immigration policy questions that brought us here today. I agree completely that substantive policy analysis should be our focus, Crockett responded. That's precisely why these inconsistencies matter. When immigration policy appears to change based on political convenience rather than principled legal reasoning or new evidence, it undermines public confidence in congressional decision-making and makes effective immigration reform more difficult to achieve. She turned to a comprehensive analysis she had prepared. For example, let's examine the specific constitutional reasoning in Senator Cruz's current border security proposal. The legislation relies heavily on the principle that federal immigration enforcement authority is virtually unlimited under congressional commerce and naturalization powers. Yet in your 2015 amicus brief in Arizona versus United States, you argued that federal immigration enforcement must respect constitutional limitations and cannot override state sovereignty or individual rights protections. Cruz's discomfort became increasingly evident as Crockett methodically demonstrated that his current positions contradicted not just his public statements but his own legal arguments in federal court. Representative Crockett, legal briefs and legislative proposals address different constitutional contexts and practical considerations. Absolutely, Crockett agreed. But Arizona versus United States and your current border security legislation both address fundamental questions about the scope of federal immigration enforcement authority under the Constitution. The constitutional principles at stake are identical, yet your legal analysis reaches opposite conclusions. What constitutional developments since 2015 justified this fundamental reversal in your understanding of federal immigration power? The question hung in the air as Cruz struggled to identify any meaningful constitutional developments that could explain the dramatic shift in his legal reasoning. The systematic nature of Crockett's presentation had effectively demonstrated that personal consistency in policy development mattered as much as political experience. Senator Amy Klobuchar, observing the exchange with visible interest, leaned forward to address the situation. Perhaps we should acknowledge that this discussion has raised important questions about consistency in immigration policy development that deserve careful consideration by the full committee. Cruz nodded gratefully for Klobuchar's intervention while recognizing that her comment implicitly acknowledged the legitimacy of Crockett's policy analysis. Senator Klobuchar raises an important point. These are complex immigration questions that benefit from ongoing examination and discussion across party lines. Crockett seized the opportunity to conclude her presentation on a constructive note. I appreciate Senator Klobuchar's observation and Senator Cruz's willingness to engage with these difficult questions. My hope is that this discussion demonstrates the value of subjecting all immigration proposals, regardless of their source, to rigorous scrutiny based on constitutional analysis, policy effectiveness, and logical consistency. She organized her materials one final time. The strength of our immigration system lies not in the infallibility of any individual legislator, but in the ongoing dialogue between representatives committed to principled policy development. When we examine immigration proposals based on their merits rather than the experience or authority of those who make them, we honor our constitutional responsibility to develop effective solutions to America's immigration challenges. As the hearing began to wind down, observers throughout the committee room recognized they had witnessed a defining moment in congressional oversight and immigration policy debate. Political commentators would later note that Crockett's methodical presentation had demonstrated how effective policy analysis could strengthen rather than weaken democratic governance by ensuring accountability at all levels of congressional leadership. The aftermath extended far beyond the immediate hearing as immigration policy experts and political observers grappled with the implications of what they had witnessed. Several policy institutes announced plans to incorporate the exchange into their seminars as an example of how systematic analysis could effectively challenge experienced political figures. Within hours, major news outlets published commentary recognizing the significance of the confrontation. Politico noted that Representative Crockett's methodical presentation demonstrated that immigration policy must be evaluated on its merits. The National Review observed that systematic analysis strengthens conservative immigration reform by ensuring intellectual consistency.